Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron.
We declare the Games Odyssey open. Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from the Olympics and Paralympics. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton. We both love the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and we love history. But most of all, we love Olympic and Paralympic history.
From the epic and inspirational moments we all love, to the more bizarre and controversial moments, we're fascinated by it all.
Which is why we are on a journey through all of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, from the ancient Olympics held at Olympia, all the way to now.
Okay, in our episode today, it's time to bring the Winter Games to the United States. So just as a reminder, the last time that the U.S. hosted the Olympics was for the III Olympiad in St. Louis, which, Sarah, was less than amazing, if you remember.
Oh, yes, we remember.
Unfortunately, we remember. And now the U.S. will become only the second nation to have hosted the Olympics twice, as the III Winter Olympiad heads to the sleepy winter resort town of Lake Placid, New York. But amid the ravages of the Great Depression, is it possible for these games to be the beacon of hope that the Olympic movement is supposed to embody? Well, that's what we're going to figure out today. So, Sarah, what did you already know about these games?
Well, I certainly knew the obvious. I knew that these games were important because, at least I knew it was important to us because it was the first Winter Olympics to be held in the United States. Mm-hmm. So I've always known that. But if I'm being completely honest, I know more about the other Olympics that happened in Lake Placid years later with the Miracle on Ice and all that. So I know we'll get there eventually. We've mentioned it a little bit in the past. So I feel like I knew just a little bit about it, and I know it's rich in its history, but I probably wouldn't even be able, before getting ready for this episode, I probably wouldn't be able to give you more than 5 or 6 brief little items about it. But what about you?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the same. There were a couple of little things here that when I was doing the research, I had a little connection made of, oh, yes, I remember hearing about this before, but I hadn't completely connected it with Lake Placid. So there were a few things here that I knew about the games, but again, if you had asked me before which games it had happened at, I don't know that I could have accurately said Lake Placid 1932. So it was fun to kind of dive back into this and remember. I say remember like I was alive in 1932, but to learn to learn more about these games. And, you know, I always have to ask this when we talk about a new place, but I feel, a little bit sense of shame as an Olympic fan that I've never been to Lake Placid. How about you?
I have not been to Lake Placid either. I've come very close where I've traveled to New York and thought, this is it. I'm going to be able to drive a few hours north. And, you know, when I've gone to New York City. And so there's been times where I've tried to make it happen and it just doesn't work out. So not yet, but it's certainly on my list.
Yep. Mine too. It would be great maybe to actually do a tour there at some point and talk to some people there.
They have a museum and everything. So
yeah, but let's go ahead and get into a couple of the highlights before we get into the main course, so to speak.
So kicking it off with the highlights of the III Winter Olympiad at Lake Placid 1932, we have that the games officially ran from February 4th to February 13th, though it technically didn't end until the 15th due to the bobsled event having to be extended, but we'll get to that in a bit. These were the first Winter Games to be hosted in the U.S., which we've already mentioned. There were only 252 athletes from 17 countries competing across 14 medal events. 8 less nations participated than at St. Moritz, 1928, due to the Great Depression. This was the first time that the podium was used in the Olympics. I know we've mentioned podium before, but that was only metaphorically. Here, it was finally a literal podium. In fact, this was the first time the organizers had specific directives from the IOC about how the medal ceremony should be conducted. And this was also the first time that we saw women participate in speed skating, but it was only as a demonstration sport.
Yeah, and that's a little surprising to me because given the acceptance of women in figure skating at this point in history, I mean, maybe this is just naive of me, but I would think speed skating would kind of be just a logical next conclusion, right?
Yeah, no, I would certainly think so. I mean, I know that they're very different sports. So
Sure.
figure skating and speed skating fans, don't come at me. I know they're very different. But
no, they're exactly the same.
Oh,
they're
gosh.
basically, there's really no difference between the two as far as I can
email
see.
Jonathan on that one, not me. But that being said, considering that they both take place on ice, it would seem pretty logical that women could participate just like men could. But then again, it was the long battle for more inclusion of women in the Olympic Games. So here we are.
Yeah, I guess my thought around it was we already know that skating was a popular activity. So you would think that some women would gravitate towards figure skating as their thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then other women who like to skate would be like, well, I don't really want to do jumps and stuff, but going fast is really fun. So I guess that was my thinking. But again, that's just maybe naive of me to think.
Yeah, but I don't disagree with your logic. So I guess we're both naive.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take a quick little break, and then we're going to get into a little bit of the background of how these games ended up in Lake Placid. All right. So as we alluded to in the episode intro, something pretty big happened between Amsterdam 1928 and Lake Placid 1932. The start of the Great Depression, which, Sarah, I've heard was really not so great.
Yeah.
I really had not connected the fact of the timing of the years that the Great Depression started right in between the Olympic cycle. Just hadn't really dawned on me.
I hadn't considered that either. And I think, like, at least for me, I'm thinking about we're in 1932. We know that 1936 is going to happen on the summer end of the thing of the Olympics. And I've been thinking so much about World War II and building up to that and the things going on in the world that I wasn't even thinking about how the Great Depression was affecting the Olympics now at where we are.
Yeah. So at this time, Lake Placid, like I said in the intro, was a sleepy little ski resort town of a whopping 4,000 people. Okay. And the idea to bid for the Winter Games came from a man named Godfrey Dewey. And here is a fun and really nerdy fact about good old Godfrey. So his father was a guy named Melville Dewey, who was the creator of the Dewey Decimal System. Now, for all you kids out there, the Dewey Decimal System is a way to organize books in a library, kind of like the old school way of organizing internet tabs. So if you ever gone to a library and you see those little numbers on the side of books, you've got good old Melville to thank for that.
Indeed.
So besides his love for book organization, Melville also had been a fan of winter sports. So he obviously passed down that love of winter sports to his son, Godfrey. So Godfrey actually attended the Winter Games in St. Moritz in 1928 as the U.S. ski team's manager. And also he was the flag bearer for the U.S. in the opening ceremony. So another little fun fact about him. And then about a month after St. Moritz, he was back at home in Lake Placid, and he gave a speech to the local Kiwanis Club about his belief that Lake Placid could host the Winter Games, especially since they already had great skiing and skating facilities available. And I guess other people kind of agreed with him because that summer he secured a bond from the Lake Placid Chamber of Commerce for $50,000 to put towards the bid. And then in April of 1929, when the IOC had their annual Congress, there were bids from several American cities: Lake Placid, New York, obviously, because that's who we're talking about. Bear Mountain, New York. I would love to see an Olympics hosted by bears. That's why it's called that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it has to be. Don't come at me, Bear Mountain people. And then Denver, Colorado, Duluth, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Yosemite Valley, California. And then there was also a bid from Montreal, Canada. So no matter what, these games were going to be headed to North America because those were all the bids. And then, of course, spoiler alert, Lake Placid was awarded the games. But Dewey's first item of business was to then figure out how to get funding for both a bobsled course and a ski jump, since those were the two things that Lake Placid did not have available. Now, raising money for the games was, well, it was a bit of a challenge given that the Great Depression was going on at this point. So thankfully, good old Dewey had an ace up his sleeve, a fellow by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York at the time. So again, I think even a lot of our international people are probably going to recognize that name. Just assuming.
Yeah. Like, especially Western countries, because you think about Roosevelt, Churchill, they were all buddies and stuff. So anyway, that's a whole nother history lesson for another time.
Whole other history lesson we'll get into. So, but yeah, with Roosevelt's help, most of the funding for the games came from the New York legislature. So thank you, New York taxpayers, for getting the games to Lake Placid. Now this was kind of cool. Dewey wanted these games there so bad that he actually ended up donating a piece of his family's land for the construction of the bobsled track. So he was like just ready to do whatever it would take to get the games there. So good old Dewey. And then when the games happened, they were obviously still impacted by the Great Depression. Attendance was very low for the games. Several countries withdrew plans to send teams. Sarah, as you already mentioned, we had less countries here than at St. Moritz. This is why. Or if they did send a team, they really scaled them back considerably, such as the British team, who only sent 4 athletes. So that's kind of what we see here. And I don't know, it kind of stinks because we saw something similar happen with St. Louis, where very few people from other countries showed up because of the cost and of a war going on and all of those things. So it just kind of seems like we just kind of keep having these problems happen on our watch. I don't know.
Yeah. Just some not so great luck for sure.
Yeah. But
like various factors there, but yeah, not the best start for American hosted, or I should say specifically United States hosted games.
Yeah. You know, and it's interesting too with the third Olympiad was in St. Louis in America, and then the third Winter Olympiad was here in the US. So apparently third time is not the charm for us. But anyway, let's see if things turn around. So tell us a little bit about what was happening when the games kicked off.
Yeah. So the opening ceremony was held on February 4th, and they were opened by the governor of New York at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, who we just mentioned.
Yeah.
Even though a cauldron had been lit for the Summer Games for the first time at Amsterdam 1928, there was no lighting of the cauldron here. That tradition would have to wait to make its Winter Games debut 4 years later. Because the British team only sent a delegation of 4 female figure skaters as their Olympic team, that means that for the first time in Olympic history, we saw an entirely female Olympic team and therefore a female flag bearer. Molly Phillips of Team GB had that specific honor. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's kind of a fun little fact about the British team. And it makes me a little sad that they didn't light a cauldron here, because you would think it would make more sense for the Winter Games because it's cold. Like, light that flame.
Yeah,
like
you're telling me.
Have somewhere for everyone to warm up, right? And then let me ask you this, since we're talking about having a female flag bearer for the first time at these games. What are your thoughts on the recent move by the IOC encouraging nations to select a male and female flag bearer for each set of games?
Overall, I'm very pleased with it. I think it's great. There's a tinge of bittersweetness there that I'll get to in just a second, but
sure.
I think it's really good for countries that are perhaps notorious for being a little more oppressive to females, that even if they have athletes that are participating in the games, many of them, and it's right now October 2022 when we're recording this. There's been a lot going on with female athletes in Iran right now. Yeah. And I'm just thinking that females that are representing Iran would never be given the chance to be front and center as a flag bearer. So I think it's great when you think about countries like that. The part of it that's a little bittersweet for me is that when you think about countries where, like in the United States, and not like, before you come at me, Americans that are listening, I'm not saying that we have cured sexism or anything like that, but I'd say that we do a pretty decent job when it comes to allowing females to compete. So that being said, when like females maybe would have had a chance to carry the flag by themselves as just being like the sole flag bearer, at least in countries where that's been generally accepted, it's kind of bittersweet because now, like, I don't know, they have to share it a little bit. Maybe that's just me being biased as a woman. So all that to say, overall, I'm very supportive of it. I just wish, I guess, that it didn't have to be a requirement to get a female to carry the flag, unless it was by default, like in this situation. What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I mean, technically it's not a requirement. Like, they encourage nations to do it. And so it's more of like a positive peer pressure situation where like no one wants to be singled out as that country that doesn't do it. That's where these tactics kind of work well a lot of times, because once you encourage people to do it, the vast majority will do it because they say, oh, that's a good idea. We actually should do this. And then a bunch of others will say, well, crap, I guess we need to do it too. And it's like, yeah, you never want to have to legislate morality and, equality. But there are opportunities like this where it can be very visually important for people to see a male and female representative from their nation and see themselves in that position. Especially, I think of kids like thinking like, I could one day, well, not me, but kids thinking I could one day be the flag bearer for my country. Right. Right. And it doesn't matter if I'm male or female, like I can have a shot at this honor. Yeah. But on that note, let's take a quick little break and then we'll come back and we will get into the events themselves.
All right. So let's talk about demonstration sports. We don't always talk about the demonstration sports, but there's two of note here worth mentioning. Curling, which I will always say is a favorite of mine. And it featured 4 teams from the United States and 4 teams from Canada. And then there was dog sled racing with 7 teams from the United States and 5 teams from Canada. There was 1 female driver in the event, Eva Short Seeley. So pretty cool that we had a female driver. Even though it was a demonstration sport, I'm happy that she was included and could participate.
Yeah, I love the idea of dog sled racing here. I mean, I don't know how I feel about it actually being an official medal event. Let me get that out there. But I love the inclusion of it here as a demonstration sport for sure.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, well, it is kind of uniquely North American. So I like that about it. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, no, it made sense. And it made sense that there were several Canadians that participated in curling as a demonstration sport, because Canada is pretty darn good at curling, if you didn't know that already. I mean, it's also Canada. They're good at winter sports, but we'll just continue to learn about that as we go on. And so speaking of moving on, we're going to move on to figure skating. Yeah. We promised we'd mention her again, but here she is. Sonja Hennie of Norway won her 2nd gold medal in women's figure skating at Lake Placid. We should also mention Beatrix Loughran, though, who is the most decorated U.S. female figure skater of all time. So that's legendary. Again,
Yeah.
we're excited about that as an American.
Sure.
That she's the most decorated. She paved the way for a lot of future athletes. She won silver in the ladies singles, which was called fancy skating in 1924 Chamonix. She was actually tied for gold with Herma Sabo of Austria, but the judges then awarded the gold to Sabo. In St. Moritz, she got a bronze, an individual, and then here in Lake Placid, she won a silver in pairs with Sherwin Badger. So yeah, she's kind of forgotten about because she never won a gold, but seriously, she was the most decorated female skater for the U.S. After these games, she had a career as a Broadway performer and also as a coach, including coaching her niece, Audrey Pepe, who would be a 3-time national U.S. champion. So I think that's pretty cool to think about because I feel like we've seen a lot of athletes in both figure skating and gymnastics, to bring a summer sport into it, who end up going on to have either Broadway or acting careers of some kind. And I feel like it's very natural because, not to say that this, again, I want to be clear with like figure skating fans. I know that it's very different than just, being on stage and acting, but you are certainly an entertainer when you are on the ice. Like, that is part of your job as a figure skater, is you are entertaining the audience. So I think it's kind of cool that she was part of maybe that. I don't want to say she paved the way for that to happen for everybody that did that, but I think it showed that it was kind of a natural thing for her to do.
Yeah, you're right. They're obviously different disciplines, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that if you're really good at figure skating, you can probably handle some dance numbers. Just thinking of the muscles that are used, the level of endurance that's needed for it, the
pressure.
The level of body expression that has to go into it. It makes sense, even though, yes, we understand they are different disciplines, but yeah, it's cool that she had an impact beyond the games, and that she became a coach and all of those kind of things. And yeah, it was sad because I had to admit, when doing the research for this episode, I'd never heard of her. I was like, and she was the most decorated, like still is the most decorated U.S. figure skater, and I don't know her name. So I felt like we had to throw her in here. So
no, and I'm glad that you did. And I think that also, where, sometimes we're excited when we hear about an American who was so decorated. It's also a reminder that here we tend to cherish gold medals above everything, and that's not always the best thing either. So
it's not always fair. Yeah. Because you said it yourself. She was tied for gold. Like her scores between the two put her tied for the gold in 1924. And really, it just came down to, the judges had to pick, okay, first place, second place. And, and that's where she ended up getting silver. So, it is what it is. Those were the rules that they had to work with at the time. But to know that she was that close to getting a gold, getting exactly the same scores as the gold medalist at those games.
Definitely. So we're going to move on to pairs figure skating, which we've kind of already mentioned because of her. But speaking of pairs, we had André and Pierre Brunet of France. They repeated their success from St. Moritz, winning their second gold medal. So they defended their title. Gillis Grafström of Sweden was unable to turn his three-peat into a four-peat, though, as he was beaten out for the men's individual gold by Austrian Karl Schaefer. So while a three-peat is nothing to be ashamed of, sorry, Betty. Sorry, Betty, that you did not get the four.
Yeah. I mean, he's had his name at the top of the list for quite a while, so I think it's fair to share it with someone else for a bit. And it's not like he walked away with nothing. He got a silver here. So
which is still a huge achievement.
Seriously. So let's talk about someone else who was able to defend their gold, though, and that would be the U.S. bobsled team led by Billy Fisk. So here in Lake Placid 1932, they defended their gold medal. We've talked a little bit about this team before and how they had a substitute, Eddie Egan, who was our gold medal boxer, from Antwerp 1920. So here is something else really interesting about this team we haven't discussed before. And that's the fact that Fisk, the leader of the team, he was only 16 years old in 1928, St. Moritz. Okay, so here he was 20 years old. He served as Team USA's flag bearer. And then the oldest member of this bobsled team was Jay O'Brien, who was 49 years old. So talk about a really interesting generational gap on that team.
No kidding.
Yeah, that you wouldn't normally see. Well, today you wouldn't see it. So again, this is where the history of this is kind of fun, because you get to see some things that just wouldn't happen in the modern day. But
right.
So during the competition, we did have our good old friend warm weather creating a little bit of havoc. So because of the warm weather on the day of the competition, the conditions of the course became a bit hazardous for the competitors. So they had to press pause on the competition, and they didn't wrap up the bobsled competition until February 15th, 2 days after the closing ceremony. So they just kind of had to hang around Lake Placid. Now, as for Fisk's long-term legacy, he also co-owned a ski resort in Aspen, Colorado, which, of course, is still a very popular skiing destination. And he helped with the creation of the very first ski lift. So that's fun. And then he was also invited to lead the bobsled team for the 1936 games, but he declined. And we don't know this for sure, but there has been talk that some people think this was because of his feelings towards Nazi Germany, that he just said, nope, no way, I'm not participating in those games because of what I see happening in Germany. So again, I don't know that he ever publicly said that, but people kind of got that impression that that's why he declined to lead the team. And here's where maybe there's a little bit of credence to that, is that in 1940, he volunteered to be a pilot in Britain's Royal Air Force. So this was because of the U.S.'s neutrality stance at that point. The U.S. had not entered into World War II yet. And so Billy Fisk actually pretended to be a Canadian so that he could fly in the RAF. He was then killed in action during the Battle of Britain. He was only 29 years old. And so since America had not officially entered the war yet, this actually made him one of the very first few Americans to die in World War II. So,
wow.
Hero status as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
That's very significant, it feels. Yeah.
I mean, based on one of the sources I read, they essentially said he was probably either the second or third American to die in World War II because of him volunteering to fly in the Royal Air Force. So he obviously did have very strong feelings about Germany at the time, and a strong sense of needing to do something about it when he had the opportunity. So, so yeah, we can remember him for that, and his sacrifice for freedom's sake. So, but on that note, we're going to take a quick little break, and then we will come back and get into some skiing.
All right, so we're going to kick off our skiing conversation with cross-country skiing. Like 4 years earlier, the 50-kilometer event would be plagued by bad weather. It had been a dry winter for Lake Placid, and on the day of the event, the start had to be delayed by 3 hours due to a snowstorm. The course was also altered, with competitors skiing a shortened loop twice. The finish went 1 and 2, with Veli Saarinen winning gold. In the 18-kilometer, the Swedes went 1 and 2, with Sven Utterström winning. Does that sound right, do you think?
Sounds right to me.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
As far as I know.
Doing our best. Okay.
I mean, the only thing that sounds wrong about it is there's no Norwegians mentioned.
I know.
That sounds a little off, but whatever.
They'll get plenty of chances, as we know.
Yeah.
Speaking of Norwegians, so going into Nordic combined, Norwegians swept the podium, led by our buddy, Johan Gevrudimsbråten. who had won gold in the 18-kilometer cross-country skiing event back in 1928. And then moving on to ski jump, Norway went 1, 2, and 3 in the ski jump, with Birger Ruud winning gold. If his name sounds a bit familiar, that's because his brother Sigmund won silver in the event at the 1928 Games in St. Moritz. During World War II, he was imprisoned in a German concentration camp for speaking out against the Nazis, but thankfully he survived the war. He was supposed to light the cauldron for the 1994 Lillehammer Games, but had to back out due to heart problems.
That's kind of sad. Too bad.
It is sad. On a side note, this is like getting super interesting how we're seeing more athletes that were going to be very directly impacted by World War II. And I like as we inch closer, and I know that there are going to be so many stories where they're not always going to survive. So
right. Well, yes, we just saw with Billy Fisk.
Yeah. So just foreshadowing that, but it's just, I know you love history and I love history. So it's fascinating that we're seeing more and more of that as we inch closer to World War II.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're already kind of, again, we know we're looking ahead in these people's lives. Obviously, those things hadn't happened yet at the games. Yeah, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit about speed skating, because for the first and last time, the American group race method was used here in Lake Placid for the speed skating events. So you might recall back in our Chamonix 1924 episode, we mentioned how Charles Jutra of the U.S. won gold despite the fact that he had never done a 1-by-1 heat, which is the European method of speed skating, where the race is broken up into many heats. Well, here, with it taking place in America, they went by the American rules, and so there was a mass group start that was used for the events. And I'm pretty certain that's why it was the last time it was used here. Probably after this point, I think enough of the Europeans were upset about the mass group start that they just said, okay, we'll do the European start from now on. Everyone else just needs to start doing that style. And then I also wanted to make sure that we do a quick callback to our pal Irving Jaffe from St. Moritz 1928. So you might recall in the 10,000 meter speed skate event, he was in first place when the Norwegian official decided to cancel the event because of the warm weather conditions. So remember, it got canceled. There was an outcry over that. The IOC said, okay, Jaffe is the gold medalist. Then the skating union jumped in and said, no, the event was canceled. And so he walked away from St. Moritz with nothing. Okay. Well, here at home in the US, he got a second shot, and taking advantage of his expertise with the American group start, he ended up kicking tail in both the 5,000 and 10,000 meter races, winning gold in both. So he got his gold, 2 golds at that.
I'm really happy for him.
Yeah, me too, because that was a rough situation in 1928. And I understand it's complicated, and I don't know what the right answer was for that situation, but I'm just glad he had that second chance here. So, and then we also need to quickly mention Lake Placid local Jack Shea. He also had a strong showing in speed skating, winning the 500 meter and the 1500 meter races. He was also the first gold medalist to receive his gold medal on a podium, since you mentioned the inclusion of the podium for the first time. Later on, he'd also become a member of the organizing committee for the 1980 Lake Placid Winter Olympics. So what this meant was that Jaffe and Shea ended up being the most successful athletes of these games by winning 2 golds. Yeah, no one else won more than that. All right, so let's talk a little bit real quick about ice hockey. Because of the Great Depression, only 4 teams were actually in the tournament: Canada, US, Germany, and Poland. But for the first time, the tournament was held in an indoor rink. So that's kind of a nice change of pace, I'm sure. Don't have to worry about the weather quite as much. So The tournament was done in what was dubbed a double round robin tournament because of the limited amount of teams. So essentially, this just meant that every team faced every other team 2 times in the tournament. And then they, tallied everything up based on wins and goals, all of that good stuff. So still, in the second matchup between Canada and the US, which was considered the unofficial final for the tournament because of the standings, the US scored first. And after going through 3 rounds of overtime, the final score was a tie of 2-2, which means that Canada had failed to win a game for the first time in their Olympic history because it was a tie. But Canada still won the gold anyway, with US taking silver because they had more wins overall, of course. And one player of note I want to mention from Team Canada was Vic Lindquist, who scored 3 goals across 5 games, including one of the goals in their opener against the US, which ended up helping them secure the gold in the end of the tournament. He was known as the Swift Swede due to his Swedish ancestry. And 4 years later, he actually ended up coaching the Swedish Olympic hockey team at Garmisch-Partenkirchen. But let's take another quick little break here, and then we'll finish off talking about the legacy of these Lake Placid games and kind of what we can remember from them. And of course, we'll talk about the medal table as well.
All right, so we're going to dive into the legacy of these Winter Olympic Games. So as we mentioned earlier, the games closed on February 13th, even though, yes, they didn't officially until the 15th.
Yeah.
The United States came out with 12 total medals, 6 of which were gold. By the way, this is the only time in Winter Games history that the United States has won the most golds. So glad we got a chance to do that once.
Great Depression, I guess.
Yeah, we couldn't do it without a little help.
Yeah, if we want to call it help, but it is what it is. So
yeah, Norway won 10 medals, 3 of which were gold. Canada came away with 7 medals, including 1 gold medal. Sweden and Finland both won 3 medals, 1 gold. And even though these games were smaller in scale as a result of the Depression, they were still considered successful and helped establish Lake Placid as an important center for winter sports and as a great resort for tourism. So that's always exciting to see when the Olympics have made a positive impact for the city that they've been held in, like for tourism and for the future. And skipping ahead quite a while, we know that it made enough of an impact for the Winter Games to come back to Lake Placid.
Yeah. So kind of looking ahead, we know that these games were successful enough that the IOC had a positive feel for Lake Placid to say, why not bring the games back there again? So, I think these games were given the tough spot they were put in by the Great Depression. They were successful. They were well run. They had everything that they needed. Not a ton of controversies or anything happening here, which is kind of nice. So, I mean, again, Lake Placid only had 4,000 people. So for such a small town to pull off a really successful Winter Games, even if it was smaller in scale, is still a huge, huge deal. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we're not going to be leaving the US quite yet, because in our next episode, we are headed to the opposite coast as the Summer Games head to the City of Angels. But still, if you enjoyed this episode,
and we really hope you did,
then hey, would you take 5 seconds, when it's safe to do so if you're driving in your car, to give us a rating in your podcast app of choice? We would greatly appreciate it, and it will help other Olympic and Paralympic fans find the show. But until next time, I'll see you later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media, LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan, and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.